Imagine standing on a wide plain, the sun not even at its highest yet, and already you can feel the heat pressing against your skin. All around you, thousands of men are gripping spears, shields, and swords, their eyes darting nervously to the horizon. Some are whispering prayers under their breath. Others just stare straight ahead, trying not to think about what's about to happen. They know one thing for certain. By the time the sun sets, the world they live in will not be the same. This isn't just another clash between kings or tribes. This is the battle that will rewrite the story of an entire civilization. The year is 331 BC. The place? A flat, dusty expanse near a small town called Gaugamela in modern-day northern Iraq. The armies standing on that plain belonged to two of the greatest powers the ancient world had ever seen. On one side, Darius III, the King of Kings, ruler of the Persian Empire, the most powerful state on earth at the time. On the other, Alexander of Macedon, a young man not even 30 years old, who had already carved his name into history with daring conquests and impossible victories. Today, their paths collide, and only one of them will walk away as master of the ancient world. But before we dive into the clash itself, you need to understand how things reached this point. Persia wasn't just another kingdom. It was a massive empire stretching from modern-day Turkey to India. Darius inherited it, but by his time, cracks were starting to show. Local rebellions, shaky loyalty, and a long list of enemies waiting for a chance to strike. That chance came in the form of Alexander. Alexander wasn't supposed to be ordinary. He had been trained since childhood to believe he was destined for greatness. His tutor was none other than Aristotle. His father, Philip II, had transformed Macedonia from a small, rough kingdom into a powerful military state. When Philip was assassinated, Alexander inherited both his father's army and his ambitions. Instead of being crushed by the responsibility, Alexander embraced it. He declared war on Persia, the greatest gamble imaginable at the time. And he won, again and again. First at the Battle of Gaugamela, where he nearly died but managed to smash a Persian force right out of the gate. Then at Issus, where he faced Darius himself for the first time. Against all odds, Alexander forced the Persian king to flee the battlefield, abandoning his family in the process. That humiliation shook the empire. But still, Darius wasn't finished. He raised another army, bigger, better, and determined to put an end to Alexander once and for all. That army was now waiting at Gaugamela. Now let's set the scene. Darius had chosen his ground carefully. The wide, flat plain was perfect for the massive numbers he brought with him. Some say over 200,000 soldiers. His army wasn't just men on foot. He had war chariots fitted with blades that stuck out from the wheels, designed to rip through enemy ranks like knives through cloth. He even had war elephants, terrifying beasts most Macedonians had never even seen before. It was meant to be overwhelming, a show of sheer numbers and power. Alexander, by comparison, had maybe 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, outnumbered at least 5 to 1. If this were a simple numbers game, Alexander had no chance. But he wasn't playing a numbers game. He was playing a strategy game, and in that arena, he was unmatched. The night before the battle, the Persian camp was alive with noise. Fires burned, men shouted and laughed, and music echoed across the plain. They wanted to show confidence, to intimidate their enemy with their sheer size and noise. In the Macedonian camp, it was different. Quiet, focused. Alexander himself supposedly slept calmly, while his men sharpened their weapons and checked their armor. To them, this wasn't just another battle. This was destiny. They had followed Alexander this far because he made them believe they could do the impossible. When dawn came, both armies moved into position. Imagine the ground trembling under the weight of so many soldiers, so many hooves. Dust rising, sunlight glinting off thousands of bronze helmets. Persians stretched across the horizon, their line so wide it looked endless. Alexander's army, by comparison, looked small, compact, like a tight knot of iron ready to strike. Alexander's formation was clever. He placed his best cavalry, the companion cavalry, on the right flank, where he himself would lead. On the left, he stationed his general Parmenion with more cavalry to hold the Persians at bay. In the center, his phalanx, rows upon rows of soldiers with long spears, trained to fight as one unbreakable wall. Behind them, reserves ready to plug any gap. And importantly, he left space between his units, which looked like weak points but were actually deliberate traps. Darius, confident in his numbers, put his best cavalry on the wings, his chariots in the front and his massive line of infantry stretching out far wider than Alexander's. His plan was simple: surround Alexander, crush him, and erase the threat once and for all. The battle began with the chariots. They charged forward, blades spinning, horses thundering. For a moment, it must have looked unstoppable, a storm of iron and speed. But Alexander's men were ready. When the chariots came close, the Macedonians simply opened their ranks, creating lanes. The chariots sped harmlessly through, and the soldiers closed in behind them, cutting down the drivers before the Persians even realized what had happened. The terrifying weapon was neutralized almost instantly. Meanwhile, the Persians tried to use their massive numbers to stretch Alexander's line thin. On the left, Parmenion was struggling, his cavalry under immense pressure. The Persians pushed hard, hoping to collapse that side. Alexander saw it, but he didn't panic. Instead, he executed his boldest move. Leading his companion cavalry, he charged diagonally toward the Persian left, pulling part of his army with him. At first, it looked like he was retreating or maybe losing formation, but it was a trick, the oblique order. By angling his line, he stretched the Persians out, forcing them to move and exposing a gap in their center. And once that gap opened, Alexander pounced. This is where you see why people still talk about him more than 2,000 years later. He didn't just send his men into the breach. He personally led the charge. Imagine thousands of cavalry thundering forward, Alexander himself at the front, spear in hand, aiming directly for Darius. Dust flying, horses screaming, men shouting. The clash was brutal. The Macedonians punched straight into the Persian center, and suddenly Darius, the king of kings, found himself staring at the possibility of capture or death. Panic spread. Darius, realizing the danger, turned and fled. And when a king flees, the army follows. But it wasn't over. On Alexander's left, Parmenion was still in danger. The Persians there hadn't broken, and they were pressing hard. Alexander faced a choice: chase Darius and maybe end the war right there, or turn back to save his men. He chose loyalty. He wheeled his cavalry back, smashed into the Persian troops threatening Parmenion, and saved the flank. By then, it was too late for Darius to regroup. His massive army dissolved into chaos. By the end of the day, the battlefield was a wasteland. Thousands of Persian soldiers lay dead or captured. The once mighty army had been shattered, and Alexander? He stood victorious. Outnumbered, facing a force that should have crushed him, he had not only won, he had changed the balance of power forever. The Persian Empire, the greatest superpower of the age, was broken. From that day on, Alexander wasn't just a Macedonian king. He was the man who now held the future of the ancient world in his hands. The dust of Gaugamela hadn't even settled when the scale of what had just happened became clear. Alexander, a man not even 30 years old, had destroyed the largest army the world had ever seen. But battles aren't just about numbers or bodies left behind on the ground. They're about what comes next. And for Alexander, the road after Gaugamela was wide open, straight into the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius III, the so-called King of Kings, had fled once again. For the second time in his career, he left his men to die while he disappeared into the distance. That choice mattered. Armies don't follow a man who runs twice. Confidence in him collapsed. Persian satraps, the governors who managed parts of the empire, began questioning whether it was even worth standing by him anymore. Loyalty is fragile when power slips through your fingers, and Gaugamela had shown everyone that Darius didn't have what it took to hold his empire together. Alexander wasted no time. He marched his men straight into Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. Imagine what that must have looked like. Gates that had stood for centuries, walls taller than anything in Macedonia, and streets filled with people who had lived their whole lives under Persian rule. Instead of crushing them with violence, Alexander played it smart. He walked in not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He respected their traditions, offered sacrifices to their gods, and promised protection. To the Babylonians, it must have felt like a miracle. The city welcomed him with open arms, and in one stroke, he gained legitimacy as not just a foreign invader, but as a ruler. From Babylon, he moved to Susa, another key city of the empire. Same story. No destruction, no chaos, just acceptance. And when Alexander marched into Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, it was more than symbolic. This was the heart of the empire, the place where Persian kings had celebrated their rule for generations. Taking it was like taking the crown itself. But here, things got complicated. Persepolis was full of treasures, literal mountains of gold and silver stacked in its halls. Ancient historians claim Alexander seized wealth so vast it took thousands of camels and mules to carry it all away. For his soldiers, it was like hitting the jackpot. For Alexander, it was fuel. With that treasure, he could fund anything. More campaigns, more cities, more power. Then came the fire. Persepolis was burned. Some say it was an accident. Others claim Alexander did it in a drunken celebration, egged on by his companions. Another version says it was deliberate, a way of avenging the Persian invasion of Greece over a century earlier, when Xerxes burned Athens. Whatever the truth, the sight of Persepolis in flames marked the final nail in the coffin for Persia. The empire's pride, its cultural heart, was gone. And Alexander made sure everyone knew it. But even as cities fell and wealth poured into his hands, Darius was still out there. Broken, yes, but alive. And as long as he lived, there was a chance Persia could rally. So Alexander didn't stop. He chased him. The pursuit of Darius became almost as legendary as the battle itself. Alexander drove his army through deserts and mountains, always just a step behind. Darius tried to raise more forces, tried to regroup, but each time he was outmaneuvered. And then, fate intervened. Darius was betrayed. His own satrap, Bessus, turned on him. Rather than keep following a king who couldn't win, Bessus stabbed him in the back, literally. Darius was captured and murdered by his own men, left bleeding in a wagon as Alexander closed in. When Alexander finally found him, Darius was already dead. Accounts say the young conqueror was furious. He covered Darius's body with his own cloak, sent it back to Persepolis for a royal burial, and declared himself the true king of Asia. To his men, it wasn't just politics. It was a sign that Alexander saw himself not as a destroyer, but as a successor. He wasn't here to wipe Persia off the map. He was here to rule it. Now, here's where things really shift. Winning a battle is one thing. Running an empire is another. Alexander suddenly found himself in charge of a territory that stretched across 3 continents. Dozens of languages, cultures, and religions under one banner. Most men would have fractured under the weight of it. Alexander, he leaned into it. He started adopting Persian customs, wearing their robes, sitting on the royal throne. He kept many Persian officials in power, blending his Macedonian officers with local administrators. It was a smart move. It gave him legitimacy. But it also caused tension. Some of his men, especially the older Macedonian veterans, hated it. To them, Persia was the enemy. They hadn't fought and bled just to watch their king start acting like a Persian monarch. But Alexander didn't care. He had bigger dreams. See, Gaugamela wasn't just about Persia. It was about what came after Persia. Alexander had his eyes set east, toward lands most Greeks only knew from stories. Bactria, Sogdiana, and beyond that, India. To him, conquering Persia was just step one in a plan to create something bigger than anyone had ever imagined. A world united under one ruler. But let us pause for a second and think about why Gaugamela mattered so much in the first place. Because this wasn't just one more fight in a long list of ancient wars. This was the hinge point of history. If Darius had won that day, Greece might have remained a small collection of states. Persia would have continued its dominance, and the cultural legacy we call Hellenism, the blending of Greek ideas with Eastern traditions, might never have spread. No Alexandria and Egypt. No Greek influence reaching as far as India. No spark that later inspired Rome. One battle flipped the script. And it wasn't just politics or culture. Think about the psychology of it. Armies across the known world now saw Alexander not just as a king, but as unstoppable. The man who took down the Persian Empire with a fraction of the numbers. His legend grew larger than life. Stories of his bravery, his genius, even his supposed divine origins spread like wildfire. He became more than human. He became a myth while still alive. But myths come with a price. As Alexander pushed further east, cracks began to show. His men were exhausted. They'd marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and though the treasure was immense, the cost was heavy. Many wanted to stop to go home. But Alexander kept pushing, always chasing a new horizon. And this is where you see how the shadow of Gaugamela followed him. Because once you've defeated the greatest empire of the age, enough stops being an option. For Alexander, there was no going back. He had shown the world what he could do, and now he had to keep proving it. To his enemies, to his men, maybe even to himself. The aftermath of Gaugamela was glory, wealth, and power, yes, but it was also the start of a new kind of struggle. Not against Persia, but against time, ambition, and the limits of what one man, even Alexander the Great, could hold together. With Persia broken and Darius dead, Alexander should have been satisfied. He was already the ruler of the largest empire anyone in Greece had ever dreamed of. But satisfied wasn't a word in his vocabulary. For him, Gaugamela wasn't the end. It was the launching point. He had stepped into the shoes of the Persian kings, and now he wanted to walk further than any of them ever had. His eyes turned east. Beyond Persia lay lands few Macedonians had even heard of: Bactria, Sogdiana, and eventually India. To most, they were distant names on the edge of maps. To Alexander, they were unfinished business. He wanted to push the borders of his empire until there were no more borders to push. The campaign east was brutal. If Gaugamela had been a clash of giants on an open plain, the wars that followed were the exact opposite. Drawn-out guerrilla fights in mountains, deserts, and frozen passes. In places like Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander wasn't facing huge armies with flashy chariots and elephants. He was facing small groups of locals who knew the terrain better than anyone, who could disappear into valleys and hit his forces from nowhere. These weren't easy victories. They were grinding, exhausting, and at times demoralizing. But Alexander adapted. Just as he had outsmarted Darius with tactics, he learned to outmaneuver guerrilla fighters with speed and ruthlessness. He built new cities as he went, planting Macedonian strongholds deep in hostile territory. Each city wasn't just a military outpost. It was a statement. This land now belongs to me. Many of those cities were named Alexandria, markers of his ambition to literally stamp his name across the world. Of course, his men weren't thrilled. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and just when they thought the journey might be ending, Alexander pushed them further. Morale dropped. Whispers spread through the camp. Why are we still marching? Isn't Persia enough? But Alexander had a way of making his soldiers believe. He spoke of glory, destiny, and the idea that they weren't just soldiers. They were part of something immortal. And somehow, time after time, they followed him. Still, the strain showed. The clash between Macedonian traditions and Persian customs kept bubbling up. Alexander had begun wearing Persian robes, adopting Persian court rituals, even marrying a local princess, Roxana. To him, it was a way to unite two worlds. To his Macedonian veterans, it looked like betrayal. They hadn't marched all this way just to watch their king start bowing to the culture they thought they'd destroyed. This tension exploded more than once. The most famous example was the killing of Cletus the Black, one of Alexander's trusted commanders. Cletus had saved Alexander's life back at the Battle of Gaugamela, but years later, in a drunken argument, he criticized Alexander's Persian ways. In a rage, Alexander killed him with his own spear. The camp was shaken. If even Cletus could die at the hands of the man he'd once saved, what did that mean for the rest of them? It was a glimpse of how far Alexander had changed since Gaugamela. And yet, the legend kept growing. Word of his conquests spread far beyond the lands he controlled. To the west in Greece, people could barely believe the stories. To the east, in India, rulers started preparing for the possibility that the Macedonian storm might reach their borders. Alexander wasn't just a king anymore. He was a force of nature. Then came one of his most ambitious moves, the invasion of India. Crossing the Hindu Kush mountains was no small feat. His army faced freezing winds, brutal terrain, and exhaustion that pushed them to the breaking point. But when they reached the Indus Valley, Alexander pressed forward. This was uncharted territory for them, a place of elephants, unfamiliar gods, and kings who ruled with a different kind of authority. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BC, Alexander faced King Porus, who brought war elephants into battle. For the Macedonians, it was terrifying. The animals were huge, armored, and loud. Horses panicked, soldiers hesitated. But Alexander, as always, found a way. He crossed the river in the dead of night, outmaneuvered Porus, and after a long, brutal fight, he won. But here's what makes Hydaspes different from Gaugamela. After defeating Porus, Alexander didn't destroy him. He respected him. He made him an ally and even expanded his rule under Macedonian supervision. It was another sign that Alexander wasn't just chasing battles. He was chasing a vision of ruling a blended world. Yet this victory also marked a turning point. Because while Alexander still had dreams of pushing further, maybe even to the edge of the known world, his men had had enough. They refused to go any further east. After years of marching, fighting, and bleeding, they wanted to go home. And for the first time, Alexander had to stop. He turned back, but the return was no easier than the advance. Marching through the Gedrosian desert nearly destroyed his army. Thousands died of thirst and hunger. By the time they made it back to Persia, the once unbeatable force looked battered and thin. And yet, even in exhaustion, Alexander's empire held. Cities had been founded, rulers had been replaced or allied, and the map of the ancient world had been redrawn. From Greece to India, Alexander's name was carved into history. But let's connect this back to Gaugamela, because everything circles back there. That single battle was the trigger. Without it, there would be no Babylonian welcome, no burning of Persepolis, no march into India, no blending of East and West. Gaugamela wasn't just a victory. It was the domino that toppled everything after. It also shaped Alexander himself. The man who had stood at Gaugamela was bold, brilliant, and decisive. The man who emerged afterward was something else. More ambitious, more ruthless, and perhaps more isolated. Power changes people, and absolute power changes them completely. The cracks we saw in his relationships with his men, his paranoia, even his rages, all of it grew out of the shadow of that victory. By the time he returned to Babylon in 323 BC, Alexander was no longer just a boy king from Macedonia. He was the ruler of an empire larger than anything the world had seen. But he was also a man stretched to the limits of what any human could endure. And as we'll see, even the conqueror of the world couldn't conquer time. When Alexander returned to Babylon, the world saw a man who had gone further than anyone before him. He had crossed deserts, scaled mountains, defeated kings, and built an empire that stretched from Greece to India. But greatness comes with a price, and by the time he set foot in Babylon again, the cracks in that greatness were everywhere. His army was exhausted. Many of the men who had marched with him from the start were dead, and those who survived were worn down to the bone. They had followed him for more than a decade, and though they still respected him, their loyalty was strained. They wanted to go home, see their families, and live off the riches they had earned. But Alexander couldn't stop. He was restless, always planning the next campaign, the next conquest. Babylon became his new base, but for him, it was just a launching point for whatever came next. He started making plans to push even further. Arabia was on his mind. He believed the Arabian Peninsula could give him new harbors, new trade routes, and maybe even more lands to add to his empire. But those plans would never be carried out, because in 323 BC, at just 32 years old, Alexander fell ill. The exact cause has been debated for centuries. Some say it was poison. Others believe it was malaria, typhoid, or some other fever common in the region. Whatever it was, Alexander, the man who had survived countless battles, who had led charges into enemy lines and faced death again and again, was suddenly brought down not by a sword or spear, but by sickness. As he lay dying in Babylon, his generals and companions gathered around him. They asked him the question that would decide the future of the empire: who will inherit your throne? According to legend, his answer was just 2 words: to the strongest. Whether he actually said that or not, nobody knows for sure. But what mattered was the uncertainty. Alexander had built his empire around himself. Without him, there was no clear successor, no plan. When he finally died, chaos erupted. His generals, men who had followed him since the early days, split his empire among themselves. Instead of one united kingdom, the world was left with pieces. Egypt under Ptolemy, Mesopotamia under Seleucus, Macedonia under Antipater, and later Cassander. The dream of a single world empire collapsed almost instantly. But here's the thing. Even though the empire fell apart politically, the cultural shockwave never stopped. Everywhere Alexander had gone, Greek ideas, language, and art had spread. Temples and theaters were built. Coins with his face circulated. Cities named Alexandria became hubs of learning and trade. Local traditions mixed with Greek ones, creating what we now call the Hellenistic world. This blending changed history. It influenced everything from philosophy to science to religion. Without Alexander's conquests, there might not have been a city like Alexandria in Egypt, with its great library that became the center of knowledge. Without his campaigns into the East, Greek ideas might never have reached India, where they influenced art and even Buddhism. And without the cultural bridge he created, Rome, which rose later, might have had a very different path. And all of this circles back to that one dusty plain at Gaugamela. That battle was the turning point. Before it, Persia still stood as the dominant power of the ancient world. After it, the road was wide open for Alexander to reshape history. If Darius had won that day, Alexander's story would have ended there, another failed invader lost to time. But because he won, the world we know today carries the marks of that victory. Think about it. A single battle decided whether Greek culture would spread across continents or stay confined to the Mediterranean. A single battle decided whether Persia would continue ruling as the ancient superpower or collapse into memory. A single battle made a 25-year-old king into Alexander the Great. And yet, the story also shows the limits of conquest. Alexander won everything, but he couldn't escape mortality. He built an empire bigger than anyone before him, but it didn't survive him. What did survive was the influence, the mix of East and West, the ideas, the legends, and the stories that kept his name alive long after his empire was gone. That's why historians still point to Gaugamela as the battle that changed the ancient world forever. It wasn't just about soldiers and tactics. It was about what it set in motion: the rise of a legend, the fall of an empire, and the birth of a new world that would echo for centuries. So when you picture that battlefield, the dust, the clash of swords, Alexander charging at the head of his cavalry, remember that it wasn't just a fight between two kings. It was the moment the ancient world turned on its axis. And everything that followed, from Babylon to India to Rome itself, was shaped by what happened on that plain.